The police cruisers rolled up to the modest bungalow on Rue Saint-Laurent just after dawn, their red and blue lights cutting through the early morning mist that clung to the streets of La Chute, Quebec. Neighbors peered through their curtains, coffee cups frozen halfway to their lips. As officers approached the door they'd walked past 1,000 times without a second thought. The man who answered wore a bathrobe and confusion on his face, but within minutes he was in handcuffs, and the quiet street erupted into whispered chaos. After 13 years of silence, after 13 years of questions that seemed destined to remain unanswered, the disappearance of Marie-Claude Lemieux and her husband André had finally been solved, and the person responsible had been living among them all along. Before we continue this story, take a second to hit subscribe and like this video. Your support helps bring these forgotten stories to light, and it means everything to the families still searching for answers. The breakthrough came through genetic genealogy, that revolutionary forensic technique that's been cracking cold cases across North America with stunning precision. Investigators had held on to biological evidence from the original investigation, evidence that seemed useless in 2011 but became invaluable in 2024. A DNA profile was uploaded to a genealogical database, family trees were painstakingly constructed, and slowly, methodically, the branches narrowed to a single name. When detectives knocked on that door in La Chute, they carried with them not just an arrest warrant, but the weight of 13 years of grief, frustration, and relentless determination. The community that had learned to live with uncertainty was about to learn the truth, and it would shake them to their core. But to understand the magnitude of this moment, we need to go back to where it all began. Back to the spring of 2011, when Marie-Claude and André were still just the couple everyone knew, the ones who waved from their front porch and kept their garden immaculate even when the Quebec winters tried their hardest to destroy it. Marie-Claude Lemieux was 43 years old in 2011, a woman whose laugh could fill a room and whose warmth drew people to her like moths to light. She worked as a dental hygienist at the clinic on Rue Principale, the kind of person who remembered not just your name, but the names of your children, your dog, that vacation you'd mentioned 6 months ago. Her patients adored her. She had a way of making even the most nervous child relax in the dental chair, usually by telling elaborate stories about her own childhood adventures growing up in the Laurentians. Her colleagues described her as the heart of the office, the one who organized birthday celebrations and never forgot to bring in homemade tourtières during the holidays. André Lemieux, 45, was quieter than his wife, but no less beloved. He was a carpenter by trade, a craftsman whose work you could find in homes all over the Laurentian region. He built custom furniture, restored antique pieces, and had hands that seemed to understand wood in a way that went beyond mere skill. People said he could look at a damaged table and see exactly what it wanted to become. He and Marie-Claude had been married for 18 years, high school sweethearts who'd managed to build the kind of life together that looked simple from the outside, but was actually a daily choice to nurture something precious. They had no children, which was a source of quiet sadness for them both, but they poured that love into their community instead, into their nieces and nephews, into the neighborhood kids who knew there was always fresh lemonade on the Lemieux porch in summer. Their home was a modest 2-story on Rue Beauchamp, painted a cheerful yellow that stood out against the more conservative grays and whites of their neighbors' houses. Marie-Claude had insisted on that color. André had told his friends with mock exasperation that barely concealed his delight at making her happy. They were the couple you could set your watch by. Marie-Claude left for the dental clinic at 7:30 every morning, her Honda Civic backing out of a driveway with the same careful precision she brought to everything. André's truck would rumble to life around 8, depending on which job site was calling him that day. Weekends, you'd find them at the farmer's market or hiking the trails at Parc Doka or sitting on their porch with books and coffee, content in the comfortable silence of people who didn't need to fill every moment with words. It was a Tuesday when they vanished. May 10th, 2011. Spring had finally arrived after a winter that had outstayed its welcome, and the town was shaking off its hibernation with the kind of relief that only comes after months of gray skies and frozen streets. Marie-Claude had gone to work that morning as usual. Her co-workers would later tell police that she'd been in good spirits, excited about a weekend trip she and André were planning to Montreal. They wanted to see a show at Place des Arts, maybe stay at that little hotel in Old Montreal they'd discovered on their anniversary. She'd been looking up restaurant reservations during her lunch break, humming while she scrolled through options on her phone. Andre had spent the day working on a custom bookshelf commission for a client in St. Eustache. The client would remember him arriving around 9, working steadily through the afternoon with his radio playing classic rock and his careful, methodical approach to the joinery. He'd finished around 4, loaded his tools back into his truck, and driven away with a wave and a promise to return the following week to install the piece once the stain had cured. Everything normal, everything unremarkable. Just another Tuesday in a life full of Tuesdays that all looked more or less the same. Marie-Claude left the dental clinic at 5:15, right on schedule. The receptionist watched her walk to her car, watched her pull out of the parking lot and turn toward home. That was the last confirmed sighting of Marie-Claude Lemieux. Andre's truck was spotted by a neighbor pulling into their driveway around 5:45, which matched his usual arrival time. The neighbor, Monsieur Bouchard, was putting out his recycling and had exchanged a wave with Andre. Nothing unusual, nothing that suggested anything was wrong. The evening was mild, the kind of spring evening that makes you believe winter might actually be over. Families were outside, kids riding bikes, people walking dogs, life happening all around the yellow house on Rue Beauchamp, completely ordinary, completely unsuspecting of what was unfolding inside. By Wednesday morning, something was wrong. Marie-Claude didn't show up for work. She didn't call, didn't answer her cell phone, and that alone was enough to alarm her coworkers. Marie-Claude was never late, never missed work without notice, never let her phone go to voicemail. The office manager called several times, then called Andre's phone. No answer. She called their home landline. Nothing. By 10 o'clock, she'd driven to their house herself, worry building in her chest with every mile. The house was locked. Both cars were in the driveway. The curtains were drawn. She knocked, rang the doorbell, peered through windows. Silence. The kind of silence that feels wrong, that makes the hair on the back of your neck stand up even when you can't explain why. She called the police. At first there was the usual hesitation, the standard response about adults having the right to go where they please, about waiting 24 hours. But something in her voice, something in the details she provided about how utterly out of character this was, convinced the dispatcher to send an officer. Constable Tremblay arrived at 11:30, and what he found would launch an investigation that would consume the Sûreté du Quebec for over a decade. The front door was locked, but the back door was unlocked, which Andre's brother would later say was unusual. Andre was meticulous about security, always double-checking locks before bed. Inside, the house was neat, orderly, but there were subtle signs that something had interrupted the evening's normal routine. 2 place settings were on the kitchen table, dinner partially eaten and now cold. A pot of pasta sat on the stove, congealed and forgotten. Marie-Claude's purse was on the counter, her wallet and keys inside. Andre's wallet was on the dresser in their bedroom, his work boots by the front door. The television was on in the living room, muted, playing to an empty couch. Upstairs, the bed was made. In the bathroom, 2 toothbrushes sat in their holder, dry. Everything suggested a couple interrupted mid-evening, mid-life, mid-sentence perhaps, and then simply gone. The police investigation kicked into high gear with the kind of urgency that comes when every instinct says something terrible has happened. Officers canvassed the neighborhood, knocking on every door within a 3-block radius. Had anyone seen anything unusual Tuesday evening? Strange vehicles? Unfamiliar people? Arguments or disturbances? The answers came back negative, maddeningly so. This was a quiet street where people knew each other, where unusual activity would have been noticed and remembered. But Tuesday evening had been completely ordinary for everyone except Marie-Claude and Andre Lemieux. Search teams combed through the nearby woods, dragged the local waterways, checked abandoned buildings and construction sites. Andre's truck and Marie-Claude's car were processed by forensic teams, every surface dusted for prints, every fiber collected. Nothing seemed out of place, no signs of struggle in the vehicles or the house, no blood evidence, no forced entry. It was as if the couple had simply stood up from their dinner table and walked out of their lives, leaving everything behind except themselves. Detectives interviewed everyone who knew them. Family members described a happy marriage, no financial troubles, no enemies they could imagine. Co-workers painted the same picture. Friends couldn't think of anyone who'd want to harm them. Marie-Claude's sister broke down during her interview, insisting over and over that her sister would never just leave, that something terrible must have happened, that someone needed to find them. Andre's brother echoed the sentiment, his voice cracking as he described a man who built furniture designed to last generations, who planned years ahead, who would never disappear by choice. The days stretched into weeks. The story made headlines across Quebec, then faded as new crises demanded attention. Missing person posters with Marie-Claude and Andre's smiling faces appeared on telephone poles and in shop windows, their edges eventually curling in the rain, the ink fading in the sun. The yellow house on Rue Beauchamp sat empty, maintained by family members who couldn't bear to clear it out but couldn't stand to live there either, trapped in the terrible limbo of not knowing. And in Lachute, in the coffee shops and church basements and backyard barbecues, people whispered theories and suspicions, trying to make sense of the senseless, trying to solve a puzzle that seemed to have no solution. Where are you watching from today? Drop a comment and let us know. And as spring turned to summer and summer to fall, as 2011 became 2012 and then 2013, the case grew cold. The investigators never stopped searching, never stopped hoping, but hope became a quieter thing, a stubborn ember rather than a roaring flame. 13 years is a long time to wait for answers, but for the families of Marie-Claude and Andre Lemieux, every single one of those days was an eternity. The morning after Marie-Claude and Andre were reported missing, Detective Sergeant Philippe Marchand stood in their kitchen staring at those two cold plates of pasta, and he knew in his bones that he was looking at a crime scene, even if he couldn't yet prove it. He'd been with the Sûreté du Québec for 19 years, worked dozens of missing persons cases, and he developed an instinct for the difference between people who leave and people who are taken. Everything about this scene screamed the latter: the purse with the wallet, the keys, the unlocked back door. The meal interrupted. These were people who'd expected to finish their dinner, to brush their teeth with those dry toothbrushes upstairs, to wake up Wednesday morning and go to work. Something had stopped them, and Marchand was determined to find out what. The forensic team spent 3 days processing the house, working with the kind of meticulous care that transforms a home into a grid of evidence markers and photographed angles. They dusted every surface, collected fingerprints, bagged fibers and hair samples, swapped for DNA. The house yielded exactly what you'd expect from a couple's home: their own fingerprints everywhere, their own DNA on toothbrushes and hairbrushes and pillowcases. But there was something else too, something that would become crucial 13 years later, even though it meant nothing in 2011. On the back door handle, on the inside, they found a partial fingerprint that didn't match either Marie-Claude or Andre, and on the kitchen floor, near the table where that interrupted dinner sat, they found a single drop of blood, just one, barely visible. The kind of thing you'd miss if you weren't looking with specialized lights and trained eyes. The blood was typed as O positive, which matched Andre's blood type, but also matched roughly 37% of the population. In 2011, the local lab could extract a DNA profile, but without a match in the criminal database, it was just another piece of data filed away in an evidence box. The partial fingerprint was run through every database available, no hits. It was maddening, having evidence but no one to connect it to, like holding puzzle pieces from a box with no picture on the lid. Marchand built his investigation the way you build a house, one careful layer at a time. He started with the people closest to the couple because statistics and experience taught him that most victims know their killers, that violence usually comes from within the circle rather than from outside it. Andre's brother Jean-Marc was interviewed multiple times. Where was he Tuesday evening? Home with his wife and teenage son, watching hockey, a fact confirmed by his family and by the pizza delivery guy who'd brought them dinner at 6:30. Marie-Claude's sister, Isabelle, had been at her book club meeting until 9, surrounded by 6 other women who vouched for her presence and her obvious devastation when she learned her sister was missing. Friends and co-workers were questioned, timelines verified, alibis checked and rechecked. Everyone came back clean. The investigation expanded outward. Had the couple had any recent conflicts? Any disputes with neighbors, contractors, clients? Andre had recently completed the job for a man named Robert Gauthier, a renovation project that had gone over budget and caused some tension. Gauthier was brought in for questioning, his defensive anger palpable in the interview room, but his alibi was solid. He'd been at a construction association meeting in Laval Tuesday evening, 40 kilometers away, with 30 witnesses. A woman named Sylvie Bergeron, who'd been a patient of Marie-Claude's, had filed a complaint about a billing error at the dental clinic. The complaint was minor, quickly resolved, but Marchand followed every thread, no matter how thin. Bergeron had been at her daughter's dance recital Tuesday evening, verified by dozens of parents, and a video her husband had recorded on his phone. The detective cast his net wider still, looking at sex offenders in the region, at recent parolees, at anyone with a history of violence who might have crossed paths with the Lemieux couple. He studied maps, looking for patterns, for connections that might not be obvious at first glance. Were there other disappearances in the area? Other unsolved crimes that might share a signature? The work was exhausting, a maze of dead ends and false starts, but Marchand refused to let it go. He dreamed about that yellow house, about those cold plates of pasta, about a couple who'd waved at their neighbor and walked into their home and never walked back out. The community of Lachute was unraveling in its own way. In a town of 12,000 people, everyone was connected by no more than 2 degrees of separation. Marie-Claude had cleaned your teeth. Andre had built your kitchen cabinets. Their disappearance wasn't something happening to strangers on the news. It was happening to people you knew, and that made it visceral and terrifying. If it could happen to the Lemieux, beloved and ordinary and careful, then it could happen to anyone. Parents started walking their children to school instead of letting them go alone. People checked their locks obsessively, installed security systems, eyed strangers with suspicion. The sense of safety that had defined this small town evaporated like morning mist. Vigils were held at the Catholic Church on Rue Principale, candles flickering in the darkness while Father Dubois led prayers for the couple's safe return. But as weeks became months, the prayers shifted, became requests for peace, for closure, for the strength to endure not knowing. Marie-Claude's dental chair sat empty, eventually filled by a replacement hygienist who felt like she was working in a shrine, surrounded by cards and photos that no one had the heart to remove. Andre's workshop, rented space in an industrial building on the edge of town, became a time capsule. His tools hanging on their pegboard, his half-finished projects covered with tarps, sawdust still on the floor from that last day in May. The first anniversary came and went with a memorial service that drew hundreds. Isabelle stood at the microphone, her voice breaking as she spoke about her sister's kindness, about how Marie-Claude had been her best friend as well as her sibling, about the hole in her life that could never be filled. Jean-Marc talked about Andre, about a brother who taught him how to use a hammer when they were boys, who'd helped him build a treehouse for his son, who was supposed to be there to grow old with him. The grief in that church was thick enough to choke on, but underneath it was something else too. Anger. Frustration. The desperate need to understand why. Marchand attended the service, standing in the back, watching faces, because you never know what might shake loose at these gatherings. Sometimes guilt brings people back to the scene. Sometimes perpetrators can't resist inserting themselves into the investigation, feeding off the chaos they've created. But if the person responsible for the Lemieux' disappearance was in that church, they were better at hiding than Marchand was at seeing. As 2012 became 2013 and 2014, the case settled into that terrible category of cold but not closed. Marchand was reassigned to other investigations, but he kept the Lemieux file on his desk, kept reviewing it during slow moments, kept hoping something would click. New detectives were brought in periodically to give the case fresh eyes. They'd review everything, interview people again, approach the evidence from different angles. But they all hit the same wall. Without bodies, without a crime scene beyond that mysteriously unlocked back door and that single drop of blood, without witnesses or obvious suspects, there was nowhere to go. The theories multiplied in the absence of facts. Some people believed the couple had been killed by a random intruder, someone passing through town who'd chosen their house for reasons no one could fathom. Others thought it was someone they knew, someone who'd hidden their malice behind a friendly face. There were whispers about organized crime, about Andre owing money to the wrong people, though no evidence of debt or criminal connections ever surfaced. A few people, desperate for any explanation that didn't involve murder, clung to the idea that maybe the couple had chosen to disappear, to start over somewhere new, though everyone who knew them rejected this as impossible. The yellow house on Rue Beauchamp deteriorated slowly. Family members kept up with basic maintenance, cutting the grass, shoveling snow, but the life had gone out of it. The cheerful paint faded. The garden that Marie-Claude had tended so carefully became overgrown, then was replaced with low-maintenance shrubs by a landscaping company Jean-Marc hired. The house stood as a monument to absence, to questions without answers, to two lives interrupted and never resumed. But while the case went cold in the investigative sense, something else was happening in the wider world of forensic science. DNA technology was evolving at a pace that would have seemed like science fiction in 2011. Genetic genealogy, the technique that had been used to identify the Golden State Killer in 2018, was revolutionizing cold case investigations across North America. Detectives were learning to upload DNA profiles from old evidence to public genealogy databases, to build family trees from the genetic matches that came back, to narrow down suspects through painstaking genealogical research. It was a game changer, but it required evidence that many cold cases didn't have. It required DNA from the perpetrator, not just from the victims. In 2020, a new detective was assigned to review the Lemieux case. Her name was Marie-Josée Leblanc, and she'd made her reputation cracking cold cases through innovative forensic approaches. She'd attended conferences on genetic genealogy, had worked with genealogists on other investigations, and she believed deeply in the power of patience and new technology to deliver justice even when years had passed. When she opened the Lemieux evidence boxes and saw that single drop of blood from the kitchen floor, the drop that hadn't matched Marie-Claude or Andre, her pulse quickened. This could be something. This could be everything. The problem was funding and priority. The backlog of cases waiting for advanced DNA analysis was enormous, and resources were limited. LeBlanc made her case to her supervisors, arguing that the Lemieux disappearance deserved another look, that the evidence warranted the expense of genetic genealogy testing. It took months of bureaucratic wrangling, of written proposals and budget meetings, but eventually she got approval. In January of 2023, that drop of blood from 2011 was sent to a specialized lab for advanced DNA extraction and analysis. The process was slow and technical, the kind of work that requires precision and patience. But by March of 2023, they had a full DNA profile. It was uploaded to GEDmatch, one of the public genealogy databases that allows law enforcement searches. And then they waited. Genealogist Michelle Thibault was brought onto the case, a specialist who'd helped solve multiple cold cases through family tree reconstruction. When the DNA matches started coming back, distant cousins and third cousins and fourth cousins, she began the painstaking work of building family trees, of tracing lineages forward and backward, of narrowing down possibilities. It took 7 months of research, of birth certificates and marriage records and census data, of eliminating branches and following new leads. By October of 2023, Thibault had narrowed the suspects down to 3 possible individuals who fit the genetic profile and had some connection, however tenuous, to Lachute in 2011. One was deceased, one was a woman, and the DNA was male. The third was a man named Daniel Rousseau, 51 years old, who'd lived in Lachute for 15 years and still lived there, on Rue Saint-Laurent, less than a kilometer from the yellow house where Marie-Claude and Andre had spent their last evening. Detective LeBlanc pulled everything she could find on Rousseau. He was a handyman, someone who did odd jobs around town, yard work and minor repairs and painting. He'd never been arrested, had no criminal record, was by all accounts a quiet man who kept to himself. But as she dug deeper, something interesting emerged. In the weeks after the Lemieux disappearance, Rousseau had left town, told neighbors he was going to stay with family in Ontario for a while. He'd been gone for 3 months before returning to Lachute and resuming his quiet, unremarkable life. And there was one more thing. Andre Lemieux had hired Rousseau to do some painting work on their house. In April of 2011, 1 month before they disappeared, Rousseau would have been inside their home, would have known the layout, would have known their routines. The pieces were starting to fit together in a way that made LeBlanc's investigative instincts sing. They had their suspect. Now they needed to prove it. Detective LeBlanc sat in her office on a cold November evening in 2023, surrounded by file boxes and family tree charts that looked like they belonged in a genealogy library rather than a police station. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as she traced her finger along the genetic connections that had led them to Daniel Rousseau, and for the first time in 13 years, Someone investigating the Lemieux disappearance felt the solid weight of certainty rather than the frustration of endless questions. But certainty wasn't enough. They needed evidence that would hold up in court, evidence that would connect Rousseau not just to the house but to the crime itself. They needed to be absolutely sure, because after 13 years of waiting, the families of Marie-Claude and André Lemieux deserved nothing less than ironclad justice. The team moved carefully, methodically, building their case the way André had once built furniture, with patience and precision and attention to every joint and connection. The first step was obtaining a direct DNA sample from Rousseau without alerting him to the investigation. This required a delicate dance of surveillance, watching and waiting for the opportunity to collect discarded DNA in a way that would be legally admissible. For 2 weeks, plainclothes officers followed Rousseau's daily routines. He worked odd jobs around Le Chute, lived alone in his small bungalow, ate lunch most days at a diner on Rue Principale. He was unremarkable in every way, the kind of person you'd pass on the street without a second glance, and maybe that was exactly what had allowed him to hide in plain sight for 13 years. The opportunity came on a Tuesday afternoon, a detail that wasn't lost on the detectives, given that Marie-Claude and André had disappeared on a Tuesday. Rousseau stopped at a Tim Hortons, ordered coffee and a donut, sat at the table by the window reading a newspaper. When he left, he threw his cup and napkin in the trash. Officers retrieved them within minutes, carefully bagging the evidence that still bore traces of his saliva. The cup went straight to the lab, and 3 days later the confirmation came back. The DNA from the coffee cup was a perfect match to the DNA from that drop of blood found on the Lemieux kitchen floor in 2011. Daniel Rousseau had been in that house the night Marie-Claude and André disappeared, and he bled there, even if just a little. The question was why, and what had happened next. With the DNA match confirmed, LeBlanc could now get warrants to search Rousseau's home, his vehicle, his phone records, warrants to dig into his financial history, his background, every corner of his life that might reveal what had driven him to do whatever he'd done to that couple. But before executing those warrants, before knocking on his door and upending his world, they needed to dig deeper into who Daniel Rousseau really was. His past became an open book, every page scrutinized for clues. Rousseau had grown up in a small town north of Montreal, the youngest of 4 children in a family that friends described as troubled. His father had been violent, frequently arrested for assault and drunk driving, eventually dying in a single car accident when Daniel was 17. His mother had been overwhelmed, working multiple jobs to keep food on the table, with little time or energy left for parenting. Daniel had dropped out of high school, bounced between manual labor jobs, lived a transient life marked by long stretches of unemployment and occasional petty crime. Nothing violent on his record, but theft charges, possession of stolen property, the kind of crimes that spoke to desperation and poor judgment. He'd moved to Le Chute in the mid-90s, seemed to settle down, found steady work as a handyman. To his neighbors, he'd become just another face in the community, harmless and forgettable. But there was a darkness there that only emerged when detectives started interviewing people who'd employed him over the years. Several women mentioned feeling uncomfortable around him, the way his eyes would linger too long, how he'd make comments about their appearance that crossed the line from friendly to creepy. One woman, Madame Fontaine, recalled hiring him to paint her living room in 2009 and coming home early from work to find him going through drawers in her bedroom. He'd claimed he was looking for rags, but she'd fired him on the spot and told her friends to avoid hiring him. The stories painted a picture of someone who violated boundaries, who felt entitled to spaces and information that weren't his to access, who made people uneasy even if they couldn't quite articulate why. Most significantly, detectives discovered that Rousseau had worked for the Lemieux not once but twice. The first time was in 2010 when he'd helped André move some heavy furniture in his workshop. The second time was in April 2011 when he'd painted their garage and done some minor repairs around the house. Marie-Claude had mentioned to a coworker that the handyman made her uncomfortable, that she didn't like being alone in the house with him, but André had vouched for his work quality and the price was reasonable, so they'd kept him on to finish the job. After Rousseau completed the work, Marie-Claude had told her sister Isabelle that she was glad he was done and they wouldn't be hiring him again. Something about him bothered her, an instinct she couldn't name but trusted. 5 weeks later, she and André were gone. The working theory began to take shape through endless hours of analysis and discussion. Rousseau had been inside their home, had seen their routines, had perhaps developed an obsession with Marie-Claude. Maybe he'd returned to the house that Tuesday evening, knowing their patterns, knowing when they'd be home and vulnerable. Maybe he'd knocked on the door and Andre had answered, perhaps recognizing him from the painting work and not immediately sensing danger. Maybe Rousseau had forced his way inside, or maybe he'd been invited in under some pretext. However it started, it had ended with violence. That drop of blood suggested a struggle, brief perhaps, but violent enough to break skin. And then two people had vanished, along with whatever Rousseau had done with them. The search warrants were executed on December 4th, 2023, just before dawn. Officers surrounded Rousseau's bungalow on Rue Saint Laurent, while Detective LeBlanc knocked on the door, her heart pounding with the anticipation of this moment. Rousseau answered in sweatpants and a stained t-shirt, his face registering confusion and then fear as he saw the police presence. He was read his rights, handcuffed, and placed in a cruiser while the search team entered his home. What they found inside would prove crucial to building the case against him. The house was cluttered but not dirty, filled with the accumulated possessions of someone who'd lived in the same place for years without ever really making it a home. In the basement, officers found a disturbing collection of photographs clipped from newspapers and printed from the internet. Photos of women in the community, including several of Marie-Claude Lemieux at various public events. There were articles about the Lemieux disappearance carefully saved in a folder, as if Rousseau had been monitoring the investigation's progress over the years. In a storage box, they found a bracelet that Isabelle would later identify as belonging to her sister, a delicate silver chain with a small heart charm that Marie-Claude had worn constantly. Rousseau couldn't explain how he'd come to possess it. His lawyer would later argue it proved nothing about the disappearance itself, but combined with everything else, it painted a damning picture. The interrogation lasted hours. Rousseau sat across from Detective LeBlanc in the sterile interview room, his initial confusion giving way to sullen silence. She laid out the evidence systematically, piece by piece: the DNA match, the bracelet, the photographs, the fact that he'd fled town immediately after the disappearance, his history with the couple, the timeline that placed him in their home that Tuesday evening. She was calm, professional, giving him every opportunity to explain, to provide an alternative narrative that might make sense of the evidence. But Rousseau said nothing, just stared at his hands and occasionally shook his head, as if he could deny his way out of the truth that was closing in around him. It was his phone records that ultimately broke the case wide open. Detectives obtained records going back to 2011, and there, on May 10th of that year, they found calls to a number that would prove significant. The number belonged to Rousseau's cousin, Marcel Rousseau, who lived in a rural area outside of Hawkesbury, Ontario, near the Quebec border. Marcel owned property there, 20 acres of woods and a small cabin where he went hunting. When detectives showed up at Marcel's door with questions about his cousin Daniel, the man's nervous demeanor told them they were onto something. Under questioning, Marcel admitted that Daniel had called him the evening of May 10, 2011, frantic and asking for help. Daniel had shown up at his property late that night in his pickup truck, agitated and refusing to explain what was wrong. He'd asked Marcel to help him dig on the property, claiming he needed to bury some construction debris from a job. Marcel, trusting his cousin and not asking too many questions, had helped him dig a deep hole in a remote section of the woods. They'd buried something wrapped in tarps, and Daniel had made him promise never to mention it to anyone. Marcel had kept that promise for 13 years, until detectives with a warrant and serious expressions appeared on his doorstep and made it clear that silence was no longer an option. On a frozen morning in January 2024, forensic teams descended on those woods outside Hawkesbury. Ground-penetrating radar had identified a disturbance in the soil consistent with Marcel's description. Excavation began with care and reverence, because everyone present knew what they were likely to find. 6 feet down, they uncovered tarps, aged and partially decomposed but still intact enough to see what they contained. Marie-Claude and Andre Lemieux had been found. After 13 years of questions, their families would finally have answers, would finally have the closure that comes with knowing, even when the knowing brings unbearable pain. The autopsies revealed what investigators had suspected. Both had died from blunt force trauma to the head, injuries consistent with being struck with a heavy object. The medical examiner estimated they died quickly, probably within minutes of the attack. It was small comfort, but comfort nonetheless, to know they hadn't suffered long. The manner of death told a story of sudden violence, of an attack that had erupted quickly and ended just as fast. Perhaps an argument, perhaps a confrontation when Rousseau returned to the house uninvited, perhaps a rejection that his obsessive mind couldn't tolerate. The exact trigger would never be fully known, but the result was devastatingly clear. Daniel Rousseau was formally charged with 2 counts of second-degree murder in February 2024. The Crown argued that while the killing might not have been premeditated in the strictest sense, Rousseau had deliberately gone to the Lemieux home that evening with intent that led to their deaths. His lawyer mounted a defense based on lack of direct evidence, arguing that the DNA proved only that Rousseau had been in the house, which everyone knew from his painting work, and that the prosecution couldn't definitively prove he was responsible for the deaths. But the cumulative weight of evidence was overwhelming. The DNA, the bracelet, the photographs, the burial site on his cousin's property, the suspicious departure from town immediately after the disappearance, the 13 years of silence. The jury deliberated for less than a day. The courtroom was packed the morning of the verdict, family members and friends of the Lemieux filling every available seat. Isabelle sat in the front row, clutching a photograph of her sister, her knuckles white with tension. Jean-Marc was beside her, his jaw clenched, his eyes never leaving Rousseau's back as the defendant stood to hear the verdict. When the foreman said guilty twice, once for each count, a collective exhale swept through the room, as if everyone had been holding their breath for 13 years and could finally release it. Some people wept. Others sat in stunned silence. Rousseau himself showed no reaction, just stood there with the same blank expression he'd worn throughout the trial, as if none of this was really happening to him. At sentencing, the judge spoke about the profound impact of Rousseau's crimes, not just on 2 lives ended too soon, but on an entire community that had lived with fear and uncertainty for over a decade. He sentenced Rousseau to life in prison, with no possibility of parole for 18 years, citing the premeditated aspects of the burial and cover-up, even if the killing itself had been sudden. Rousseau was led away in shackles, and for the first time since that May evening in 2011, the people of Lachute could close a chapter that had been left terrifyingly open for far too long. The yellow house on Rue Beauchamp was eventually sold to a young family from Montreal, people who knew the history but chose to see it as just a house, just walls and rooms that could be filled with new memories and new life. Marie-Claude and André were laid to rest together in the cemetery on the hill overlooking Lachute, the town they'd loved and served and never planned to leave. Their headstone is simple, elegant, bearing their names and the dates that bookend their 2 short lives, with an inscription that reads, "Toujours ensemble, always together," because in the end, that's what they were and what they remain in the hearts of everyone who knew them. Detective LeBlanc keeps a photo on her desk. Marie-Claude and André at a friend's wedding, dancing and laughing, caught in a moment of pure joy before anyone knew how the story would end. She looks at it sometimes when the work gets heavy, when another case seems impossible to crack, and she remembers that patience and persistence and technology can deliver justice even when years have passed, even when hope seems lost. The Lemieux case taught her that truth has a way of surfacing eventually, that secrets buried in the ground or carried in guilty hearts don't stay hidden forever. 13 years is a long time, but for Marie-Claude and André Lemieux, justice finally arrived, carried forward by genetic markers, invisible to the naked eye, by family trees constructed from fragments of code, by detectives who refused to let their story end in silence. And somewhere, in whatever lies beyond this world, 2 people who loved each other and loved their community can finally rest, knowing that the truth caught up with the darkness that tried to erase them, and that they are remembered not for how they died, but for how they lived.